Well, welcome to a study now of First Peter, and I'm going to devote 2 sessions to the introduction to it, and then we're going to get right into what it's all about. Make sure you invite your friends to listen online during this COVID time, and those that are coming to Sunday school. I hope this is a blessing. So let's get into the book. Well, welcome. It's in the evening here. I'm recording. Uh, but in our Sunday school class, we're going to be looking at various charts, and I want to show you how to develop your First Peter chart so that your own study into the Bible can be most profitable. This just happens to be a very, very wonderful book, and I'm reminded really by a chart that Charles Swindoll developed, and I made a copy of it, which I included word studies that he thought were important in the book, as well as a few other things related to the writing of it and the purpose. Okay, and really the purpose of First Peter, I think, is well said by Dr. Swindoll. Christ gives hope in hurtful times. Christ gives hope in hurtful times. And that's really a marvelous thing that God does for us. So we're going to be looking at that and various things. Now, the chart that we're going to be looking at here, okay, I developed it and it's color-coded for you. In the bottom, I tell you where my sources are according to the various colors. And because I had to make the colors such so that the text shine through, the one blue is a little lighter than I would like it to be, but I'll show you what that is. This book has wonderful, wonderful keywords, and when you study it and you record your own keywords, they may include some of these: hope, suffering, for sure, maybe sobriety, imperishable, holy, definitely, submitting or submit, yes, shepherd, always, humble, and doing good. And the study that I did in the paragraph divisions that you see there in the white, I tried to reduce it to 3, maybe 4 words or so, and it isn't easy, but in the process it makes you think. Obviously the titles, there's more in the paragraphs, not only to be discovered, but to be marked down. But in a title and in an overview, this is a good way to start to get a handle on the book. Having the discipline to put it into 2 or 3 words, 4 words, 5 words. The space that I give you is not that large, so you're sort of limited that way. But the point is, by making a concise statement, your cranium, your mind has to work overtime, and you're looking for the main ideas. But you may come up with very good wording, and your wording, once you get into this, can compete and be better than mine for sure. But it will help you, and you'll start to see the book as a whole, and even you may discover neat little connections between the paragraphs as the writer recycles some of the truth in other parts of the letter, like we saw in the book of James. Well, Peter does a little bit of that himself, and it helps you to see it. Now, in the light yellow, those are my title heads of each chapter. Okay, you can see I got a little long. I think one has 7 words. Another one has 8. So I was a little bit wordy, more than probably I would like, but such as it is. In your particular document, I'll show you where you'll have an ample time to make it an idea what you think that chapter is about. So I cover chapters 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All right. And then I made a summary of what I think the book is about. If you don't mind, I'll go ahead and read that. From salvation to maturity is what Peter has in mind. We are in a spiritual battle where there are casualties. We should not be surprised when we become Christians. We have entered into this battle and we suffer for it. We are to grow and walk in this light. We don't want to be suffering because of sin, but when we suffer, we want to be for the will of God or in the will of God. We are to engage Satan, who's in spiritual darkness, living in the light and the love of God. And that's my summary. But you'll have an opportunity to write your own summary. Okay? Now, in that real bright blue in the middle, sky blue, we have Dr. Schofield's outline. And if you notice, his sections overbound the chapters. They're not limited to the chapter. Chapter 1 goes into chapter 2, Christian suffering and conduct in light of complete salvation, 1:1 to 2:8. Now, this is actually not a bad way of looking at 1 Peter. The subjects they go on. And they're not contained in the chapters. So he divides the middle section as the largest part of the book, the Christian life in view of believers' position and the vicarious suffering of Christ, 2 verse 9 to 4 verse 19. Okay, this is the heart of the book. And then finally he comes to chapter 5, where he talks about Christian service in light of the coming of Christ. And I really like that. That's a very good perspective. I added the and Sylvanus, okay, which is in 12 and 13 of chapter 5. Now we have in the light pale blue a contribution from Bowen and Wilkinson in their wonderful book and series, Talk Through the Bible, that they did back in the 1980s. And it's a very good work and an overview of New Testament survey, and their charts are wonderful. So I put a couple lines of their chart into this study, again showing you that there's a little bit of difference here, isn't it? The first part, the salvation of the believer, goes from 1:1 to 2:12. And then the submission of the believer covers roughly 2:13 to 3:12. And then finally you have the suffering of the believer in 3:13 to 5:14. Very good way of looking at the book. So I like both the Schofield way of looking at the book, or this particular approach by Wilkinson and Boa. And so I think it's a good way to understand what's going on, even better than my chapter by chapter and what I'm asking you to do. But as you see this book, you're going to see Peter continuing his argument in chapter 1 over into chapter 2. You're going to see his argument in chapter 3 going over to chapter 4. And you're going to see actually that argument continuing all the way up into chapter 4. And then finally he gets into some kind of an idea of what's happening in the 5th chapter. And that. So the second half of the book deals with suffering, the middle part deals with submission, and the first part deals with salvation. Now Boa and Wilkinson further developed this, where the salvation of the believer is dealing with salvation, and then sanctification, and then there's a whole practical section there in 2:13 to 3:12, where you're looking at submission in government, business, and marriage and life. It's very good. And then we're starting to deal with our conduct in light of suffering. So we're looking at our conduct in suffering, Christ's example in suffering, the commands and the imperatives that God gives us in regard to how we are to live through these hard times, hurtful times. And finally, like we've seen before, it just doesn't do to stay in a suffering mode. We are also to serve the Lord. And how do we serve the Lord while we're suffering? Psychology really is struggling with that itself. But the real key that we see in the Bible is during hurtful times, we are still trying to live for God. And we're trying to serve the Lord because it's bigger. And of course, Peter doesn't deal with the suffering like sickness or other issues. He deals primarily with the suffering that occurs because we're walking with the Lord and we're serving the Lord in ministry. But obviously, Peter gives room for the suffering that happens both in our natural life as we age, as well as the various conflicts that we may find in us. Finally, right there at the bottom of the chart, this is really a good thing that Jensen does, and other people allude to it, but I think it's crystal clear that we need to understand 1 Peter in light of the fact that Jesus is coming again. Okay? Our theology of suffering has to include the Lord's coming and what it means in relationship to our conflicts and our suffering. There is a future teaching that's part of this. It's suffering. Peter is really talking about hope, and our hope is built in nothing less than Jesus Christ and his righteousness, as the song says. But, we have a hope that's sure. It's heaven. We're pilgrims here today. We're strangers in that. But we have a hope. We have a hope. We're dispersed. We're ongoing sporadic sufferings because of Christ. But we have a hope in heaven, you see. It's sure. And he's coming again. So he is going to come and he's going to judge. And, there's so many wonderful things here. So this gives us some nice things. Now, the key verses are wonderful, aren't they? First, we have Peter 1:7. that your genuineness of your faith, being much more precious than gold that perishes, though is tested by fire, may be found to praise and honor and glory at the revelation of Jesus Christ. Okay? And we find in Peter 1:16, because it's written, be holy, for I am holy. Okay? And a wonderful verse that gives us a real flavor of the book. And finally, in our ministry, of course, but that we sanctify the Lord of God in your hearts, always being ready to give a defense to everyone who asks you a reason for the hope that is in you, with meekness and fear. We are a people of hope. There may be much around us that isn't right, and there may be a need for much care and love to be expressed. Peter talks about that. But we have a hope, a guarantee that we are going to be with the Lord, and that all of this means something. And it means something to others as we share our faith. And we, in hurtful times, in times when people aren't accepting Christ, we find a way to share Christ because we have that hope. And we do so with love and with kindness and with meekness and fear in our walk with God. Okay, great verse. And then, of course, in 4:19, therefore, let those who suffer according to the will of God commit their souls to Him in doing good, as to a faithful Creator. We have a hope. We're suffering, and we're doing it over the will of God. We're not doing it because of sin. We're not suffering because we did wrong. We're suffering because we've done what's right, and we are committing our way to the Lord. And, we have a hope, you see. Our lives are short. They're not long, but we have a hope that we're going to be with Him. And while our bodies may see corruption here on the earth, we ourselves will be incorruptible as we're with the Lord in heaven. It's, these are great things. Okay. Now, finally, our last key verse, casting all your care upon Him, for He cares for you. This particular treasure of a verse has been applied so many times in our life. It comes right out of the heart of the Psalms, and it's just a wonderful, wonderful truth. In hurtful times, we can cast our care upon Him, and the reason for that is we know He cares for us. And, no matter what we're going through, that's a bottom line emotional anchor, a spiritual anchor, that we can rest that He is caring for us even through life and even through death. Great stuff, okay? Great stuff. So, that gives us a thing about the hope that we have, and I'll come back to that, okay? Now, I started out doing a paragraph study, and here you can see that my paragraph study had longer sentences. This particular approach gives more room for writing on that. But I did discover something this week. Notice, if you will, I was looking at what I call Peter's Law. And Peter's Law is found in Peter 3, verses 1 through 7. There is 6 verses that Peter talks to girls. Now, girls today would say, "Oh yes, that it's a man's world, and we're getting, we're getting yelled at for 6 or 7 verses, and men they only get one verse." You know, when I was a missionary in Africa, uh, my interpreter's name was Peter. Okay, and Peter, he died. He lived to be a very, very old man. He lived into his 90s, and Peter, he was around 60 when I knew him, and yes, he had good health, but he lived, just until last year when he passed away. But he he used to interpret for me, and when I would teach anything about girls, women, he would actually, I call it the enhanced version of interpretation. He went on for a long time, really energetically, just really preaching it. and I'd look over at him and I would say, "Peter, I'm not sure that you're actually giving the audience word for word what I said. I appreciate the fact that you are um, amplifying the truth, but when I talk about men, your statements are rather close to mine, and it's a very brief translation that you're giving to people." And he laughed, the audience laughed, because they knew what he was doing. They just heard it. And I said, "No, in all fairness, Peter, we have to try to preach what, the sermon is and what I'm giving here. So, please try to be accurate." But notice here, what I think may have been an imbalance maybe initially between the counsel between women and men. If you just keep your arrow over to 5 verses 1 to 4, and you see Peter is picking up his conversation with men again. So the number of verses that Peter spends in relationship to the ministry of men and relationship begins to balance out verse-wise. And rest assured that God has a lot of verses for men, probably more than he does for women, but a lot of times what he has for men includes both men and women, and we know it. We know it. We've known it for years. I guess people today are sensitive to point it out more because, there's a lot of people sensitive about this. So, but I just wanted you to see how important it is when you read a whole book, like this chart indicates, that you can actually see relationships between other teachings. And here was one. Okay, so that was my chart that I did, that I worked out for you, and I was very happy to do that. Now I want to show you another chart that I pulled up. I did a couple of these from different people, but I'm showing you this one. And what I like you to do at home with this chart, first of all, if you'd like the chart itself, I would like to, format it in a way that would be easy to print out. But you can see here, the orange, that is me using up space in the chart because the chapters only had so many paragraphs. And so I had space to use. So I put some further comments that relate to the introduction. And these are my contribution. The yellowish material that you see comes from Dr. Constable's notes on his introduction to First Peter. So we know that First Peter was written by the Apostle Peter himself. And so I have a note here about Peter, and I'm connected to Liberia to try to make a difference even as an old man. I probably never be able to go back to Liberia, but I am working to help the church there grow. Peter, his father was a slave to American Liberians, and he served me and very well as a friend and translator. He was a kind man. So pray for Liberia.